Hello, everyone. I wrote down a few notes because I don't want to screw this up. So let's get this out of the way because I am very capable of screwing things up. I am an alcoholic. My name is Tom. Um, I just want to wish you all a good morning, and I am really pumped to introduce this man. He's the guy who's made AA's early days feel like a story that, we're all a part of. And I know he's here to talk about the flying blind period because I saw the flyer from his book, writing the big book, the creation of AA, taking us back to when AA was just a spark of hope. A little bit about Bill. He calls Fairfield, Connecticut his home. It's a place where he's blended brains and heart as a scholar, author, and a rare book dealer. At Fairfield University, he earned degrees in history and philosophy, diving into thinkers like Nietzsche and William James under his mentor, Professor King Dykeman, who got him hooked on chasing big ideas. He even co-taught college courses with Dykeman on those philosophers, sharpening his knack for untangling complex stories, which he does very well in this book. Before all that, Bill served 3 years in the U.S. Air Force, stationed at bases like Lackland and Texas, bringing discipline to his later work. Back in Norwalk, Connecticut, he ran Schaberg Blueprint Company, sorry, early for me, a family printing business for over 30 years, pouring his energy into it, then serving as vice president for the new owner after selling it in the late 80s. As a rare book dealer, Bill's Athena Rare Books is a standout, part of the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America and the Grolier Club, a New York hub for book lovers. In 1995, he published the Nietzsche Canon with the University of Chicago Press. It's a deep dive into Nietzsche's works that showed he could make history sing with clarity. His spark for AA history research started when he snagged a pre-publication multi-lith copy of the big book at auction, a rare 1939 draft printed before the first edition of the big book even hit the shelves. That find obviously helped to light a fire, launching him into 11 years of research, combing through archives like Stepping Stones and AA's own records in New York to uncover AA's true story. In 2019, Bill gave us Writing the Big Book, a nearly 800-page, and I'm going to say it, masterpiece. Now in its third printing, that's become a cornerstone for anyone curious about AA's roots. And this flying blind period that he's sharing about today, roughly 1935 to 1937, it captures Bill W., Dr. Bob, and folks like Hank Parkhurst. And I'm going to let him say his catchphrase about that one. I'm not stealing it. But they were groping their way toward a program, trying ideas, failing, and keeping at it with nothing but grit and faith. He even created a free 12-step work group guide you should all look for, downloadable online. And it's to help people in recovery walk the steps together with no strings attached. His research lifts up unsung heroes like Parkhurst, who pushed hard for the big book when others doubted it, making us feel closer to AA's founders. Introducing him isn't simple. Obviously, that's why I'm struggling. But I can say that Bill's got a heart for recovery, sharing his findings in talks across the country, from small groups to big conferences to the internet and more. Today, Bill's bringing that early AA spirit to life, making those long-ago struggles feel as real as our own. His talk's a chance to see how a few determined folks can build something that's still saving lives right here, right now. And I thank you for allowing me to make this introduction. I now hand over and extend a warm welcome to Bill Schaberg. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Whoa, whoa. Not sure I can live up to all of that stuff. All right. As you can tell, I'm not just an old guy. I'm a technologically challenged old guy. So I'm really happy we got this going. My name is Bill Schaberg. I'm the author of a book, Writing the Big Book, The Creation of AA, which most of the material we're going to talk about today comes out of. And the title I picked for this thing is Flying Blind Until April 10th, 1939. Now, my book, Writing the Big Book, The Creation of AA, it's got more than 600 pages of details. Tom's right, it's almost 800 pages once you add the appendices and the endnotes. So it's It's a big book. And when it first showed up here in the house, my lady Sarah said, "Oh my God, William, it's bigger than the big book. It's bigger. It's the bigger book." And it is, in fact, bigger than the big book on all levels. So, for those of you who have not read my book, it's a result of 11 years of research, as Tom mentioned, into primary documents. This is a real important thing. We're talking about going into archives and looking at letters that were written in 1935, 36, 37, 38, and 39. So I've done all this primary document research, which is what the story is based on. The book delves deeply into the first 5 years of AA history, telling the story of how the Big Book came to be written and published. And the story told in writing the Big Book is supported by 416 informational footnotes at the bottom of the page and 1,570 citational endnotes, just in case you want to know where I got that particular piece of information. But today, in the interest of time, we're going to have to drive by many of the messy details that you'll find in my book and stick to the basic story of how the Big Book came to be written. Now, for those of you who have read my book, I should tell you ahead of time that this presentation is going to cover some important elements of that story that have only become clear to me since writing the Big Book was published 5 years ago. So these new elements are really interesting and, to my mind, extremely important facts about the unfolding story of Wilson's changing ideas of what the Big Book should and should not say. But we'll get to that as we go along. Let's just start at the beginning here. Bill Wilson called the 4.5 years from December 12, 1934, the day that he got sober, to April 10, 1939, the day the Big Book was published, the flying blind period. Now, it wasn't until almost 3 years into the flying blind period that anyone even thought of writing or publishing a book. And Wilson called it early on the Book of Experience. It was a book about how their new cure for alcoholism actually worked. So the first mention of writing a book happened at the famous Counting Noses meeting. That's where they realized, oh, good Lord, we've got 40 people sober here. And that meeting was held in Akron, Ohio in mid-October of 1937. But to understand why the idea of writing a book was so long in coming, and most especially what purpose it served once it finally did arrive, we need to briefly review what happened, very briefly review what happened during the first 3 years of the flying blind period. So here are the major players. Bill Wilson gets sober in December of 1934. Dr. Bob Smith gets sober in June of 1935. Hank Parkhurst gets sober in New York City in September of 1935. And if you've never heard of Hank, just buckle up and we'll get to him. Fitz Mayo gets sober in November of 1935 in New York City also. So throughout most of those 3 years before this flying blind period, those 40 newly sober men, they were all deeply, deeply, deeply embedded in the Oxford group. And quite frankly, it was basically a get on your knees and surrender to Jesus program. But in the spring of 1937, New York City, the New York City group broke with the Oxford group, which had been the starting point and the very foundation of all their sobriety. I mean, we cannot ever underestimate the impact and influence of the Oxford group in how Alcoholics Anonymous turned into the group that it is. So here we got these guys now. All of a sudden they're saying, hey, we found a cure. We've got a cure. They called it a cure in those days. We got a cure for alcoholism. So what do we do now that we're no longer joined at the hip with those Oxford group people? Those were the people that were the door openers, and they were having Oxford group meetings, not AA meetings. Hence, the big 3-part plan that Bill Wilson proposed at the Akron Counting Noses meeting just 6 months after the New York group had broken from the Oxford group. Number 1, we need to build a string of alcoholic hospitals all across the country. Now you got to realize, people, this is the 30s here. So this whole idea of like A&P, the string of A&P supermarkets, was brand new. And Wilson has this vision that because regular hospitals don't want to pay attention to drunks on most cases, we're gonna set up our own national chain of alcoholic hospitals. And if we do that, that means number 2, we're going to need a lot of paid missionaries. people to go out there and start meetings in different cities where we just started these hospitals and fill those beds. And number three, we need to write a book that presents our discovery to the world. So that's the first mention of anyone saying, let's write a big book. Most of the Akron members were not happy about this. They were really opposed to this corruption of their movement. All of a sudden, we're getting involved with money and real estate and publishing. And no, that's just not what we're doing here in Akron. But nevertheless, when those three proposals were put to a vote at the Counting Noses meeting in mid-October 1937, they all passed by the barest of majorities. And the reason they passed with the barest of majorities was that Bill Wilson had brought a whole bunch of New Yorkers with him. They were like votes in his back pocket, you know, and so it did in fact do it. But the Akron people say, okay, you won the vote, Bill, but you got to go back to New York where the money is, because we're not going to give you a dime for these things. Bill Wilson rushes back to New York to raise some money. But over the next 7 months, he's out there really pounding the pavement, trying to get people to give him some money for these big projects. He and Hank Parkhurst only make one donation that they get is from $5,000 from John D. Rockefeller Jr. And that's not for AA. Bill always said, oh, John D. Rockefeller gave AA the money. No, it was for Dr. Bob Smith. It went exclusively to Dr. Bob Smith to keep him so he could pay his mortgage and his nurse and keep his office open and do the fabulous work that he was doing out there, because Dr. Bob was doing fabulous work out there. But that's it. That's all they got. Wait. Bill and Hank are in New York for 7 months running around. Who's this Parkhurst guy? I mean, most people in AA had never heard of Hank Parkhurst. Hank Parkhurst was Bill's right-hand man in New York City. And after Bill Wilson, he is without a doubt, drop dead, the most important person in the story of how the big book got written and how the big book got published. So here's that handsome devil, one of my favorite characters in early AA history, Henry G. Parkhurst. I call him the forgotten co-founder. Now, he's a forgotten co-founder. Why is he forgotten co-founder? Well, he's all about written out of the story because he drank again. The book is published in April of 1939. By September 1939, Hank's drunk again, and he never gets sober again. And he becomes something of a thorn in Bill Wilson's side on a whole bunch of different levels. I mean, maybe we should call him the co-founder who drank. It's not a very doesn't engender a lot of hope in somebody who just came to Alcoholics Anonymous to find out that the guy who was so important in all of these early things during the Flying Blind period got drunk right after the book got published. He was, however, so critical. And I mean, we're going to see a whole bunch of this stuff in this presentation in so many different ways to the book project that I can confidently state, no Hank, no big book. Would we have ended up with a book in maybe 1940 or 41 or 40? Yeah, I do believe we would have, but it wouldn't have been the book that got published on April 10th, 1939. That book owes its lifeblood to Bill Wilson, who wrote it, and Hank Parkhurst, who was always on him to keep doing stuff and to change things that he didn't like that Bill Wilson was writing in our book. So, April of 1938, that's 6 full months after the Counting Noses meeting, Hank Parkhurst convinced Bill that, look, we don't need a whole book, Bill. I don't need a whole book. But if you'll just write me 2 chapters of this proposed book, we'll be able to use them to get appointments with a whole bunch of rich donors in New York City that we haven't been able to get to so far. So for the first and only time in 1938, Wilson goes back to Akron, Ohio, and on April 20th, he proposes this whole idea. We should start writing the book. I should start writing this book that we talked about. We haven't gotten, we're not going to get the hospitals real soon. We're not going to get the paid missionary. We can't get even money for any of that stuff. But we could start working on a book, couldn't we? This doesn't go well. It doesn't go well at all. The Akron people are really still upset and opposed to the whole project. And this isn't to denigrate what was going on in Akron, Ohio at all. They're saying, listen, Bill, you published this book. All of a sudden, we got a meeting once a week in New York. We got a meeting once a week in Akron, Ohio. And that's what we got. And you're going to have all these hundreds of people showing up in Akron and New York City. What the devil are we going to do with all those people? It's going to destroy the whole thing. So it's very easy for me, at least, to understand why these people were so opposed to the book project. They just didn't see it working out the way it did, in fact, work out. And really, I don't think they shared in Bill Wilson's vision of spreading the message of recovery worldwide, certainly all across the country at this point. So Bill leaves Akron without calling for a vote in April. He had called a vote the previous October, but he had a whole bunch of votes in his pocket, as I said. So he doesn't call for a vote. Bill Wilson was a consummate politician. He really, really was. I mean, his survival through all the trials and tribulations between this particular period and his death in 1971, he was a consummate politician. He was really good, really, really good at that. So he could see which way the wind was blowing. He didn't call for a vote on oh, should we do a book or shouldn't we do a book? Should I start on the book or shouldn't I start on the book? No vote. Back in New York, May 18th, 1938, just 1 month after this visit to Akron, where they really didn't like the idea of writing a book, Charles Towns Hospital, where Bill Wilson has his white light experience and finally gets sober, Charles Towns donates $500 to the Alcoholic Fund for an advance on the book. That's literally what it says on the check stub that can be found in the archives. So Charles Towns donates $500 so that Bill Wilson can start writing. And 2 days later, on May 20th, 1938, Bill starts writing the big book. Now, the 2 chapters that he's going to write are There Is a Solution. This is going to be number 1. And Bill's Story. That's going to be number 2. It isn't until much later that Bill's story gets moved in front of There Is a Solution. This is number 1 chapter, There Is a Solution, and then testimony to how that solution described in There Is a Solution works, followed by Bill's story. And he begins with the easiest chapter to write, his own story of recovery. So The Strange Obsession is Bill's first attempt to write his own story. And this is what it looks like. This is, look at all these great, I love this thing. It's just beautiful with all the scribbles out and stuff put in and moving things around within the text. And also up in the upper left-hand corner, he's got 125 over 875. Bill Wilson's counting the number of words on each page, and there's 875 words in this thing that he's writing before he quits. It amounts to just 8 handwritten pages. And he quits. And I think he really quits because he's deep in the woods with Dr. Silkworth. He's not talking about himself. He's talking about a conversation that Dr. Silkworth and his wife Lois had. So he quits with The Strange Obsession. Bill types up the next version of his own story. And this is a copy that came out of Stepping Stone's archive. And this is kind of what it looks like. And it's kind of a strange document. It's got this huge amount of white space on the left-hand side, even more than shows here. And every single line of this thing is numbered. I have no idea what that's all about. It goes to 800 something before you get to the end of it. So this is often called the original story. And it's 36 pages long, and it ran to almost 12,000 words. Now, that's a problem. Later in the middle of later in June, Bill writes a letter to Dr. Bobby, says these major chapters should be 5,000 words each. So he's trying to hit 5,000 words. So 12,000 wasn't even close, you know? And when even though he's got 12,000 words, he still hasn't left Towns Hospital, you know? Bill's he's doing one of those jumps that my sponsor philosophy professor used to say, you know, the kids would come in and just fill up the blue books. They dump everything they thought they knew about the topic into it. Well, Bill was doing that kind of thing here. Finally, he gets a little control over his material. So here it is, chapter 2. This is Bill's story. This is a copy of a typing that we'll find in GSO in New York City. And it's 11 typed pages of just 5,347 words. So, okay, we're in good shape here. You know, we're not 12,000, we got 5,300. So that's the right ballpark. With that easier task done, I mean, you know, you can write your own story. You can say whatever you want. Who can gainsay you on it? Bill now had to confront the almost impossible job of describing their cure in a way that would satisfy all parties. It is not possible to overstate how different the program in Akron was from the program in New York at that time. Akron was still deeply involved with the Oxford group. They would be until December of 1939, months and months after the book was published, whereas Wilson and the New York group had bailed on the Oxford group in the spring of 1937, and they were running on their own, and they were making changes all the time in how this thing was working for them. So this is what this looks like. Again, this is a screenshot of what comes out of New York City. And there is a solution with 12 type pages, and it's 5,800 words. Nah, it's not 5, but it's hanging in there, 5,800 words. Looking over Bill's shoulder, as these 2 chapters are being written, Hank Parkhurst, his right-hand man, is not happy. He thought Bill's solution was far too religious. Hank was advocating for a book based on moral psychology. This incredibly important argument will go on between Bill Wilson and Hank Parkhurst right up until April of 1939, when the book is finally printed. Religion versus moral psychology. Nothing had more impact on the final text of our big book than this argument. So, exactly what is this moral psychology that Hank is advocating for so strenuously? Moral psychology is Dr. Silkworth's solution to the alcoholic's problem. And if you read the doctor's opinion carefully, you'll see 2 mentions in that particular chapter of moral psychology with no explanation of what he's talking about, but it is right in there. So what's moral psychology? A year before, in April of 1937, Silkworth wrote an article that was published in the Medical Record on the reclamation of the alcoholic. And there was 4 sections to it. This is the 4th section in this thing devoted to moral psychology. He says, moral psychology, we believe that this decision is in the nature of inspiration. The patient knows he has reached the lasting conclusion. He's hit bottom and experiences a sense of great relief. Hit bottom and I'm in the hospital. These individuals, introverts for the most part, and I always think I have to pause here because I always think of an introvert as somebody who's quiet and off in the corner all by themselves. That's not what we're talking about here. These individuals, introverts for the most part, whose interests, here's the introvert, whose interests center entirely in themselves. Once they have made their decision, frequently ask how they can help others. Whoa, the essence of moral psychology is how you can help others. Getting your head out of your butt and paying attention to the rest of the world. And he gives a couple of cases. He's already, earlier in the paper, he's given cases 1 and 2. This is case 3. Following through elimination of medical rehabilitation, this patient made a satisfactory physical return. He then took up, this is after we'd done all the stuff we needed to do medically for him, he then took up moral psychology and in 2 years' time has entirely recovered his lost fortune and has been elected to a prominent public position. Case number 4, this is obviously Bill Wilson. Following the course of treatment, again, we got to do the medical stuff first, in which the alcohol and toxic products were eliminated and his craving thereby counteracted, he took up moral psychology. And he has gathered about him a group of over 15 men, all free from their former alcoholism through the application of this method of treatment, the medical treatment, and moral psychology. To such patients, as a solution, we recommend moral psychology. And in those patients who have joined or initiated such group, the change has been spectacular. Okay, so here, that's what Hank's pushing for. I mean, he's saying, what's the problem, Bill? It's Dr. Silkworth's solution. And so the arguments begin. As Bill was writing the first version of There Is a Solution, Hank's jotting down his ideas about what should and shouldn't be in this particular chapter. And there's 11 handwritten pages here. This is what the first one looks like. And if you see at the top there, it says Chapter 1. Now, Chapter 1 is There Is a Solution. Chapter 1 is being dictated. And he's not happy with what's being dictated. And that's all Hank's handwriting. At the very bottom where it says Hank's ideas, that's Bill Wilson's handwriting. So we don't have time to go through all of these sheets. I find them all fascinating, but in the interest of time, but this particular 3-page thing, observations, I think is really, really indicative of what was going on between these 2 guys in the early June of 1938. observations. He says, Bill, one of the easiest and most talked of things among us is a religious experience. I believe that this is incomprehensible to most people. Simple and meaningful words to us, but meaningless to most of the people that we're trying to get this over to. In my mind, religious experience, religion, etc., should not be brought in. We are actually irreligious. How's that for an outstanding statement? We are actually irreligious, but we are trying to be helpful. Moral psychology. We have learned to be quiet, to be more truthful, to be more honest, to try to be more unselfish. Moral psychology. To make the other fellow's troubles our troubles. Moral psychology. And by following 4 steps, most of us have a religious experience. Moral psychology can lead to a religious experience, not the other way around. Bill Wilson has got the cart before the horse as far as Hank Parker's is concerned. The fellowship, the unselfishness, moral psychology appeals to us. I wonder, he says to Bill, if we are off the track. A very good merchandising procedure is to find out why people do not buy our products. It is good reasoning to find out why. I am fearfully afraid that we are emphasizing religious experience when actually that is something that follows as a result of 1, 2, 3, 4. In my mind, the question is not the particular strength of the religious experience as much as the improvement over what we were. Kind of the essence of the argument these guys are going to have for months and months now. Hank, in his ideas, was also the first person to name our fellowship in our big book. Thank you, Hank. In this document, he sketched out the title page of the book being written. And there it is, title page. Alcoholics Anonymous, published by Alcoholics Anonymous Incorporated. This early June appearance of the phrase Alcoholics Anonymous is the first instance I have found in the records anywhere. And I would, if somebody else has found something, I'd love to hear about it. But that's the first thing. I don't know that Hank Parkhurst invented that phrase. I don't know where it came from. But this, as far as written documentation, this is the very first time this shows up in any of the archival materials held in half a dozen different places around the East Coast. So they're having all these arguments, but despite all those arguments, on June 17th, 1938, just 1 month after Bill had started writing, they send out the first promotional package with those 2 chapters in them. And immediately after that, and I mean immediately after that, Hank creates an outline for the big book. And we know it's immediately after that because there's this exchange. They send these 2 chapters to a New York banker, and then he writes back, and then Wilson writes back and says, oh, by the way, we just made this outline. Here's this new outline for you. So Hank Parkhurst creates this outline for the big book. And this is what this one looks like. My lady Sarah and I, my wife, and I were at stepping stones going through different folders on opposite sides of the table, and she found this piece of paper, and she was like, well, William, you got to stop what you're doing to come over. This is what we've been we knew, we had read about it, because he says to Dr. Bob that he's going to send him the outline. So we knew there was an outline, and he was going to send the banker the outline, but we had never seen the outline. So there's the outline. And Hank Parkhurst had created this. There's 25 chapters. 23 of which actually reflected what did in fact happen in the big book. Now, this is an interesting thing in the very beginning, their idea of how this book was going to run. So number 1 and number 2 are There Is a Solution and Bill's Story, which have just been written. And 3 through 15 are going to be more stories. The first several are going to be 5,000 word stories, and then they're going to be followed by a bunch of 5,000 word chapters with 4 or 5 different people doing 1,000 word recollections of those things. But the point here is that it's going to be stories. There Is a Solution gives you the general outline, and then we're going to go into the stories. And then after that, we're going to get to what I call the expositional chapters, what would correspond to more about alcoholism, we agnostics, 5, 6, working with others, that kind of stuff. So those chapters are going to come after we've convinced you how great this thing works by reading all of these stories. June 23rd, 1938, just 1 week after sending those new chapters out to the New York banker, Bill finally writes to Dr. Bob, telling me he started to write the book. He sends Bob the first 2 chapters and the outline. Now, this particular letter is not dated, but because he sent him the outline and because we know exactly when the 2 chapters and the outline were written, The June 23rd date is pretty damn solid. It might be 22, it might be 24, but after that, he sends these things out to Dr. Bob. He's already sent them out publicly, boom, but he sends them out to Bob. And despite all of the Akron objections he had hit when he was there in late April, he tells Bob, we came to the conclusion that in a tentative way, a beginning should be made. Sorry, Bob. So, I mean, just really got to be clear here. Those two original chapters were written despite the Akron members' strong disapproval of that entire project and without any, not an iota of input from Ohio. And in that long letter, Bill says to Bob, look, I'm sending you this thing, and it might be a good idea if you show this stuff around generally. Show this stuff around generally. Might be a good idea to do that. Now, before we move on, it's important to note that these two chapters, There Is a Solution and Bill's Story, contain the very essence of what Bill Wilson believed to be the cure that they had discovered for alcoholism. The very essence in these two chapters. There Is a Solution and Bill's Story clearly present three essential elements for the program of recovery as it was being practiced during the flying blind period. There is a solution. It says, number one, if you're a real alcoholic, you have no mental defense against the first drink. That's the story, folks. And number two, if you can get yourself a vital religious experience, and it was called a religious experience, not the vital spiritual experience that it later got morphed into when the book got published, it can stand between you and that first drink. Two essential elements. Bill's story has the third essential element. You know, when you know you got no defense and you've already had yourself a white light experience someplace, when all else fails, when all of their measures fail, work with another alcoholic is going to save the day. So I want you to note right now, as we're just doing these two chapters, that we'll be seeing each of these three essential elements for sobriety expanded into individual chapters once Bill starts writing again, which isn't going to happen for 3 months. Meanwhile, real life goes on. Now, this doesn't really apply to the book, but I just can't possibly drive by this, you know. So I'm looking in Lois's diaries, and Monday, June 27, 1938. So this is just 10 days after Bill's mailed out the first copies of those two new chapters, and he sent them off to Dr. Bob. You know, he's on a roll with this thing. Lois's diary says, I got mad at Bill. We had a big fight over there in Brooklyn, and he went over to Jersey for lunch. He came close to taking a drink. Damn. In historical days, she put together a little bit more clearly. She said, I got mad at Bill and he dashed out to take a big drink. Screw you, Lois, I'm going to the bar. But instead, he went to Hank Parkhurst, and Hank Parkhurst tossed him off the ledge. Thank you, Hank Parkhurst. I can't imagine that any of us would be here today if Bill Wilson got drunk on June 27, 1938. It would have blown the whole thing right out of the water. Over the next 3 months, from mid-June, when they mailed those packages off, to mid-September of 1938, Hank and Bill raised absolutely no money. No money for the chain of hospitals and the paid missionaries to fill those beds. And nothing more gets written on the big book. 3 months. Bob's getting his small monthly checks. They're $5,000 being doled out to him on a monthly basis from the Rockefeller connection. But Bill, Fitz, and Hank, they are dead broke. They got nothing. They haven't raised any money, and they're really growing desperate. Surprise. Hank Parkhurst has a new plan. This guy has a new plan every third day, you know? There's this Sunday newspaper magazine supplement called This Week. And it's got a circulation of over 5 million. It's printed in New York City, but it goes out all around the country, and it gets put in newspapers and all the major cities around the country. So you open your Sunday newspaper, and here's this little magazine section called This Week. 5 million copies. Early September 1938, one of their members has an in with This Week magazine, and he's going to write an article about their cure and get it placed in the magazine. In that article, Hank Parkhurst wants them to offer several chapters of their upcoming book for just $1. Hank says, $1 is really reasonable. I mean, it's just because it's the price of a pint of cheap whiskey. I mean, if you're one of those 5 million, let's just take a number out of the air. Let's just say 50,000 of those people have a drunk in their house and they want to know more about this, and they send us $1. Whoa, okay, we're in Fat City again here. So this is how he's hoping to raise some money. But Billy says, we've only got 2 chapters. And people are going to expect more like 5 chapters if they send us $1. And so, with Hank's prompting, Bill Wilson starts writing again on September 15th, 1938. That This Week proposal drags on for weeks and weeks. I mean, everybody and his brother gets involved with this thing, including a couple of the Rockefeller guys and Bill's brother-in-law, but falls apart completely. Doesn't happen. Just doesn't come to any fruition at all. But in the meantime, Wilson is committed to writing the rest of the big book. He's in. He's in. He started and he's doing the deal. On September 27, 1938, just 12 days after he started writing again, Bill sends the first drafts of More About Alcoholism and We Agnostics to Dr. Bob in Akron. Note, as I mentioned earlier, note that More About Alcoholism, the story of the man of 30 and Jim who puts the whiskey in his milk and the jaywalker story and Fred the accountant, is devoted entirely to Bill Wilson's brilliant diagnosis of the real alcoholic's problem. You have no mental defense against the first drink. That's what that chapter is about, people. And We Agnostics is devoted entirely to the solution Bill has offered to the alcoholic's problem, and there is a solution. You need to get yourself a vital religious experience that can stand between you and that first drink. That's what those 2 chapters are about. In his September 27, 38 to Dr. Bob, Bill tells him that 2 more chapters of the book are close to completion. So we got the first 2, Bill's story, and there is a solution. Now he's sending him these 2 more about alcoholism, We Agnostics. 2 more chapters of the book are close to completion. I am enclosing the original dictation on 2 of them so you can get a rough idea. You will understand that what I am sending you is just the rough, uncorrected outline. We'll let you have the polished product when ready. The chapter More About Alcoholism seems to meet with general approval, but see if you can think of some other points which should be covered in it. The chapter We Agnostics, I don't like so much. It's still too preachy and rather disconnected. I know a bunch of people who still think it's a little too preachy and disconnected, but we're going to drive by that. Bill says it might be better done on an entirely different basis in the form of a dialogue between one of our former agnostics and a tough-minded bird lying in a hospital bed. I can't imagine Bill Wilson writing a platonic kind of dialogue there, but I presume that this is a Hank Parker suggestion. What do you think, Bob? Perhaps it would be well not to show everybody these chapters. Now, this is a little different from the stuff that went out in June. It was like, you should show this stuff around generally. Except where you think people can contribute some new ideas which can be incorporated in the final write. So again, to be clear, in other words, I know some people out there opposed to this project. And it really got stirred up, perhaps, when I sent those first 2 chapters out. So don't bother showing these chapters to those guys. Let's just show them to people who might be willing to, quote unquote, contribute some new ideas. October 3rd, 1938. Frank Amos, one of the Rockefeller guys, gets Bill and Hank an appointment with a friend of his at Harper and Brothers. And they go down there and pitch the book to him. And Harper's, they love the idea of publishing this book. They offer Bill Wilson $1,500 advance. Bill is really, really, really excited about this offer. And he's a little knocked out that a really prestigious publisher like Harper and Brothers thinks he can actually write a book like this. So much so that they're going to give him $1,500. Hank argues loudly they just got to turn this deal down. They got to turn this deal down. He tells Bill, among many, many, many other arguments, if this book proves to be our main textbook, if this book you're writing turns out to be our main textbook, why would we want the main means of propagation for our message in the hands of someone else? Shouldn't we control this thing? Just fantasize about how this whole deal might have gone if Harper Brothers had been publishing the big book for the last 86 years here and making changes possibly whenever they wanted to. Shouldn't we control this thing? Thank you, Hank Parkhurst. Rockefeller people all disagree and strenuously advise against self-publication. They say, what do you guys know about it? You know nothing. But Hank prevails in his arguments with Bill. Hank has a better plan. Again, he's got another better plan. He says, we're going to form our own company, the 100 Men Corporation, and we're going to sell stock for $25 a share. Now, Wilson always said they called it Works Publishing right from the jump street, but Works Publishing doesn't show up until, that name for the company doesn't show up until February 14th later. But at the beginning, it was called the 100 Men Corporation. And that money is going to be used to support the Parkhurst family while the book is being prepared. Well, what's Bill going to live on? I mean, Bob's got the money coming for Rockefeller. Hank's going to get it from selling this stock. What's Bill going to live on? Charles Towns to the rescue yet again. Towns offers to pay Bill $300 a month for 5 months, which comes out to $1,500, the same as the Harper's offer. And it's going to go $200 once Bill gets it. He's supposed to keep $200 and give $100 to Ruth Hawk, who is Hank Parkhurst's secretary in Newark, New Jersey, at his business Honor Dealers, who's actually the one who's going to be doing all the typing on this thing. And the first check from Charles Towns arrives on October 14th, 1938. So now Bill's got some money coming in. Dr. Bob's got some money coming in. Hank's hoping to sell some stock so he can get some money coming in. Meanwhile, out in Akron, Bill's constantly asking Bob for those personal stories. They want all these personal stories. Everybody's got to write a personal story. But Bob is having real trouble getting people to write them. Del Tryon actually does write a story, and then he pulls it. Dr. Bill Dodson, AA number 3, he refuses to write a story. And Earl Treat doesn't write a story, which is a little, I mean, Earl's the guy who got sober in Akron and goes back to Chicago and starts AA in Chicago. This would be a hell of a story. But it's not. These guys, from everything I can tell and from things that were said afterwards, these people all thought that this book was just a money-making deal for Bill Wilson, and if they were going to write a story that's going to appear in Bill Wilson's book, they wanted to get paid for it. And since there was no money available one way or the other, there was a lot of resistance. There was a lot of resistance to this this whole idea of a book, and most especially of writing their own stories. But Bob's getting some heat from Bill all the time, so he comes up with this really great solution. He enlists Jim Scott, a recently sobered up newspaper man, to quietly go out, have a little coffee with some of those Akron members, and then go home and write their stories for them. And that's what Jim Scott does. November 3rd, 1938, Bill sends Dr. Bob 3 new chapters. And he says to Bob, he says, I'm enclosing you 5 chapters, 2 of which you have already seen in the rough. You've already seen more about alcoholism, and you've already seen We Agnostics. All these can be improved a lot, and I agree that the chapter of the agnostics should be longer and perhaps somewhat different in character. I'm turning out this stuff as fast as I can, Bob, being only once corrected dictation. You can't call it serious writing. After I get all through with these general chapters on the present basis, I will edit them as carefully as I can, bearing in mind the criticisms and suggestions from anyone who wants to make them. So you might be showing this stuff around, asking people what they really think. Now we're going back to maybe you should be showing this to everybody, not just those special people. I find it pretty hard to get people to voice their real opinions. This is in New York City, as they are too much afraid of hurting the author's feelings. So I wish you would make a special effort to get people to speak their minds, because I'm writing this book and this train is leaving the station. In my opinion, the stuff I have done is not always clear. It's sometimes too long-winded and may not always be the best possible presentation. So I wish you would tell people to speak up or forever hold their peace. Because as I said, the train is leaving the station. I hope to get out there about December 1st. Important date here, folks. I hope to get out there about December 1st for a week or 2 so we can cover these matters better. Everybody who has seen the personal stories from Akron thinks they're great. So the first of those 3 new chapters, the 3 new chapters that Bill sent to Dr. Bob on November 3rd, 1938 was Working with Others. Having expanded on his brilliant diagnosis of the alcoholic's problem, you have no mental defense against the first drink and more about alcoholism, and explain in detail the proposed solution, you need to get a vital religious experience in We Agnostics. Working with Others presents an explicit game plan for how to practice Bill's advice from his own story. When all other measures failed, work with another alcoholic would save the day. This is really the third essential part of the program. I mean, just think about Bill Wilson. He's the thirstiest. It's June of 1935. He's pacing the lobby of the Mayflower Hotel in Akron. I mean, he's the thirstiest guy in the world, right? And he knows he has no defense against the first drink, and he knows he had this wonderful white light spiritual experience 5 months before in Towns Hospital. But he's ready to go in the bar and maybe get him. He says in one of his talks, maybe just have a ginger ale so I could strike up a good, interesting conversation. And he realizes that's another one of those BS stories that he's been telling himself in the past when he ended up drinking again. So when all else fails, when the knowledge of what kind of an alcoholic you're a real alcoholic is, and what this religious, you need to find yourself a religious, spiritual entity to stand between you and the first drink. When those things aren't working for you, you need to talk to another alcoholic. And what does Bill do on that June day in the Mayflower Hotel in 1935? He gets on the phone and he's looking for a drunk, somebody he can talk to, and he ends up talking to Dr. Bob. The spiritual necessity of working with other alcoholics, I love this. The spiritual necessity of that was made even clearer in the multilith printing of this chapter. This is what it says in the multilith. Comes out. It's a pre-publication copy of the book, and it says in that multilith copy, this is the opening lines of Working with Others. Practical experience shows that nothing will so much ensure your own immunity from drinking as intensive work with other alcoholics. It works when other spiritual activities fail. Now, they deleted the word spiritual before the April 10th, 1939 printing, which I think is a kind of a sad thing. I like the identification of working with others as a spiritual activity. Broadens the whole concept a little bit, at least for me. Working with others is thus the third essential element in the program of recovery. A program of recovery that was being practiced in Akron and New York City in 1938. Having finished those 3 primary chapters, celebrating the solution as promised, and there is a solution, Bill Wilson felt that he had now clearly explained what people in New York and Ohio were doing to stay sober. Wait. You mean to tell me that that was the program of recovery in 1938? Those 3 things? Yeah, that's what I'm telling you. Now, you won't find that striking claim in my book, but it is something that's become crystal clear to me since the book was published, that I continue to do research on the writing of the big book, because there's a number of contemporary letters and facts that confirm the fact that Bill Wilson thought he was done. He was done explaining the program of recovery once he had finished writing Working with Others. There's a bunch of just evidence here. The 12 steps, as we're going to see, were really an afterthought that came to Wilson in the first week of December. But in his November 3rd letter to Dr. Bob, he tells him, I hope to get out there about December 1st for a week or 2. So that is one very conclusive piece of primary document evidence that Bill thought he would be finished in the next 4 weeks. But it wasn't finished until the very end of December, more than 8 weeks later. Hank Parkhurst also thought that they were just about done, that the book was just about done. He has this meeting with Janet Blair, and he writes her a letter on November 7th. Janet Blair is one of the 2 editors of the big book, and he hired her to do that. And he writes her a letter on November 7th, and he says, according to schedule, Mr. Wilson will be through with the first write of the book by December 5th. So in these 2 early November letters, both Bill and Hank's projected dates for the book completion implied that the program of recovery had already been sufficiently explained by early November. There's also a wealth of now that's primary document evidence. There's also a wealth of circumstantial evidence to support this. For instance, none of the stories in the back of the first edition printing of the big book, all written in late 1938, early 1939, say anything even remotely like the 12 steps. Or for that matter, anything like those mythical 6 steps. The program of recovery offered in those 29 stories can all be boiled down to 3 common elements. 1, admit you're licked. Oh yeah, you have no defense against the first drink. You're licked. Number 2, surrender your life to God. Oh, get yourself a vital religious experience. Number 3, act accordingly. Help others, pray, meditate. Sound familiar? The final piece of circumstantial evidence that Bill thought he had conclusively explained the program of recovery once he had finished writing Work with Others is that he now felt free to move on to some of the outside issues that face a newly sober man. Okay, we got you sober, now what's going to happen? And in fact, the other 2 new chapters Bill sent to Dr. Bob, along with Working with Others, on November 3rd, 1938, were exactly that, to wives and the family afterwards. Note that both of these chapters were not written by the wives of alcoholics, as it says in the text of our book, but rather by Bill Wilson himself. And yes, Lois Wilson never forgave him for this. She wanted to write that chapter. And no, Bill Wilson never offered the writing of that chapter to Ann Smith. What Bill did offer Ann Smith was to write one of the chapters in the back of the book called The Wife of an Alcoholic. And Anne demurred. She didn't want to do that chapter, that story in the back of the book. So rather than offering it because Anne turned it down, it was offered to Marie Bray out in Akron, and she wrote that story in the back of the big book, first edition. November 4th, 1938, as managing editor, Hank Parkhurst hires Janet Blair to be one of the book's 2 text editors. He's already secured a man named Tom Usel's services to be the other editor. Now, Usel's going to take the macro view of the text, and Janet Blair, she's going to work the sentences, the paragraphs, the pages all by themselves. And on November 9th, 1938, just 6 days after sending Bob Smith those 3 new chapters, Bill writes to Bob, complaining about the lack of response he's gotten from him and from the other Akron members. Glad to hear you like the chapters, I said to Bob. I wish you would be more critical of them, for I think they can be improved a lot. Then, in another bit of primary document evidence that the program of recovery had already been described in sufficient detail, he tells Bob Smith, I have but 2 more of the general chapters to write, and then I shall come out. And those general chapters would be, those 2 would be, and 2 employers and a vision for you. And again, at this point, there's no idea yet of the need for 2 additional chapters based on the 12 steps. Note, too, that this November 9th letter to Dr. Bob Smith positively contradicts all those urban legends about how the big book was written by its first 100 members. Glad to hear you like the chapters I sent you, Bob. I wish you would be more critical of them. Later, Bill Wilson said that he sent the chapters out to Ohio, and this is a quote, for debate and inspection. But that, quote, that Dr. Bob, quote, never passed them around very much, merely writing me saying he thought they were all right. And in Alcoholics Anonymous of Age, Bill also said that despite his repeated requests for checking and criticism of the proposed chapters, Akron offered him, quote, nothing but the warmest support. I would call that damnation with faint praise. November 1938, Parkhurst and Ruth Hawk go to a writing school in New York University, and they both now feel much more free to critique Bill's writing. And Bill later commented that he didn't go for Hank's advice much. I can imagine that. I love the images I get in my head of these 2 guys arguing in this small office of honor dealers in Newark, New Jersey. Around the same time, while desperately trying to sell stock in the 100 Men Corporation, which is another fascinating story in relation to the creation of the big book, Hank Parkhurst writes to employers. And by the way, I can find no evidence that Bill ever sent this chapter out to Akron at this time. In November 1938, Parkhurst also writes the Q&A chapter. The Q&A chapter. The Q&A chapter is 15 type pages with 94 questions and answers. And I mean, again, it was one of those, I'm in the archive at GSO, and Michelle brings me out this folder, and I open it up, and I'm like, what the devil is this? I've never even heard of this. Never heard of this. This is the chapter that got written that didn't show up in the book. And it's just a beautiful thing. And again, it's in the paperback copy of my book doesn't have the 10 appendices, but the hardback does, and all of the Q&A chapter is in there. It just makes for great reading. It's an unpublished chapter. Bill obviously rejected it, but it does provide just an amazing snapshot of 1938 AA in New York City from Hank Parker's perspective. This is an on-the-ground thing, baby. This isn't something somebody's telling you 20 years later, oh, this is how it was in New York City. This is what he saw in November 1938. By mid-November 1938, Bill has also written the final chapter of Vision for You, which is basically a telling of the Akron story. There's only a little passing mention of New York City's group, but there's all kinds of four-part harmony on what happened out in Akron, Ohio. So in some ways, I think this was a politically, like I said, Wilson was a great politician. So he's trying to get these people in Akron on board. So the Vision for You is like, I've got to count someplace where it's like 60 paragraphs and 40 of them are all about Akron. You know, it's one of those kind of things. And then, so Wilson writes A Vision for You. Then on November 16th, 1938, Charles Towns writes Henry Ford. Wilson's always trying to get Henry Ford to write a foreword for the book. I mean, he's just doing this repeatedly throughout all this period. But on November 16th, 1938, Charles Towns writes to Henry Ford, a guy he had met before, saying, quote, the manuscript, which is now ready for the press, except for the foreword I'm hoping you're going to write, November 16th, ready for the press. We're ready to go. We're going to go to press. This piece of primary document evidence that the book was considered done at this point is reconfirmed by Charles Towns' mid-November 1938 letter that he writes to the American Medical Association asking them to endorse the AA method. Included with his letter, he sends them the final, quote-unquote, final chapter, A Vision for You, as proof of AA's success in getting people sober. Those two Charles Towns letters provide conclusive primary document evidence that by mid-November 1938, the book was considered to be basically done and ready for the outside editors. But still, no 12 steps. However, sometime in very late November or early December, Bill Wilson decided that the program of recovery he had already written about in those chapters left alcoholics just too much room to wiggle out of it. Talks about them alcoholics wiggling out of this, the solution that he's offering. He plugged that gaping hole during the first week of December 1938 by writing the 12 steps, and over the next 3 weeks he wrote How It Works and Into Action. How It Works and Into Action are 2 chapters explaining how to work steps 3 through 11. They get dropped into the manuscript between We Agnostics, which covers steps 2 and 3, and Working with Others, which covers step 12B. Sandwiched right in, folks. Okay, last minute, I wrote the steps, I wrote the chapters, we're going to stick them in here. January 2nd, 1939. By this time, we're done. It's done, and it's been sent off to Tom Usel, the big editor. And he has the manuscript, and he writes to Hank Parkhurst on January 2nd. He said, on reading additional chapters, you've seen the first 2, but now he's got all of them. On surveying the job as a whole, I found myself deeply moved, at times full of amazement, almost incredulity. And during most of the reading, I was extremely sympathetic. My feeling at the moment is that you should certainly hold on to the production and distribution of this volume. Don't give it to Harper Brothers, if you can, for she ought to go far, wide, and handsome and net those concerned a neat profit. Whoa, whoa, music to Hank Parkhurst's ears. We're going to make some money off this thing. Parkhurst was always saying, and Wilson was always saying, that they were going to sell this. When this book came out, it was going to sell by the carloads. And they weren't talking about Chevy vans. They were talking about railroad carloads. I mean, they were just going to sell a ton of these books and make a ton of money. Early February 1939, Dr. Silkworth writes The Doctor's Opinion. It cobbles together 2 different things. A June 27, 1938 letter of recommendation that Silkworth had written and given to Bill Wilson so he could get appointments, so he had some credibility, with some material that Silkworth would later publish in a July 1939 medical journal. Strangely, Silkworth's name does not appear at the end of this thing, and it's one of those questions I get asked all the time. Why isn't Dr. Silkworth? I have no idea. I have no idea. It's one of the great mysteries of early Alcoholics Anonymous history. So I can't shed any light on that for anybody who's curious. The New York members have been arguing for months over the best name for the book, and it's finally come down to two names, The Way Out and Alcoholics Anonymous. February 11th, 1939, Hank Parker sends Fitz is down in Maryland, and he just goes over to Washington, D.C., the Library of Congress, and he discovers that they have 25 books called The Way Out, but none called Alcoholics Anonymous. Okay, end of that competition. Now we know what we're going to call the book. Remember that on November 3rd, 1938, just as the book was nearing complete, November 3rd, the book's getting there, Bill had written to Dr. Bob and that I find it pretty hard to get people to voice their real opinions as they are too much afraid of hurting the author's feelings. Here's an eyewitness account of a December 1938 meeting in Berkeley. We don't have much eyewitness stuff from this particular time period, and this is one of those things. This was Tom Burrell, who was at the time 3 or 4 weeks sober at this point. And he goes to this meeting at Bill's house, where Bill's reading from his draft of either chapter 5 or chapter 6. Tom says, after the meatballs and spaghetti or whatever we had, they used to actually have food before meetings. The wives, of course, would put that together. This same tall, lanky guy came out of the dining room with a legal pad, and he sprawled out on the floor with his back to the folding doors, and he started to read what he had written on that legal pad. Now, maybe I was too fogged up, a recently sober guy, and didn't get the full significance of this thing, but at any rate, I listened while these folks wrangled. Change a comma here, a question mark here. One said, you don't put that in, put this in. And finally, the meeting ended. So much for the weighty, blood-on-the-floor arguments that supposedly happened over the text of the big book. These people are critiquing his punctuation, for God's sakes. They're not taking it apart word by word, sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph, chapter by chapter, and just beating each other over the head with all the changes they insisted be made. Did not happen that way, people. While this was clearly the case out in the New York meetings, and the Akron members, most of the Akron members weren't even shown those chapters. There were some real arguments, but they took place in the Newark, New Jersey office at Honor Dealers between Hank Parkhurst, who wanted a moral psychology book, and Fitz Mayo, who wanted an explicitly religious book. He actually wanted an explicitly Christian book. Fitz's father was an Episcopalian minister, and Fitz had gone back to the church with a vengeance, and that's what was working for him, so that's what he wanted in the book. Hank thought moral psychology would work for him, and that's what he wanted in the book. Hank wins big time. Now, one of the reasons is Hank Parkhurst is he's just a steamroller kind of guy, and Fitz Mayo's a little bit of a milquetoast kind of guy. So I can just see Bill Wilson kind of leaning up against the wall with his arms crossed, letting these two guys duke it out. He's not going to get in the middle of it. Bill didn't like to argue. Lois liked to argue. Bill didn't like to argue. Wilson was reluctant to change most of the things he had written. He hated to change what he had already written. And boy, I can identify with that every time my wife starts Xing stuff out and telling me that this is all wrong and it's got to be moved around. Wilson was the same way. He didn't change it. But he did agree to adopt some of Hank's most important suggestions. Higher power, power greater than ourselves, God as we understand him. These are all the overall movement of getting the book moved from the religious, specifically religious, to substituting the word religious for spiritual over and over and over again. It's a repackaging deal, and that was Parkhurst's mission. January through February 1939, we just don't know who did what to the manuscript before the pre-publication multilith copy was made in mid-February. I mean, Bill's been working on it. He's been constantly making changes. I've seen 3 different typed copies of There Is a Solution in the archive, the thing that was written in June of 1938, and he's tinkering with the words all through the whole thing. He's making all kinds of changes to it. Tom Usel, he cuts Bill's story. He takes off like the first 7 or 8 paragraphs. He just whacks them out, and then he insists on moving it to the front of the book. He says you can't start the book where there is a solution and then all this other stuff and then finally get to the stories. If you want to get a real alcoholic's attention, you got to start with a success story. and your story is the best. You're the first guy, so we got to put your move. So Usual insists they move the story to the front of the book. I can't believe that Bill Wilson felt very bad about that, but that's how that happened. And Janet Blair, she's making all kinds of significant changes. There's a bunch of letters between Janet Blair and Hank Parkhurst, and also one with Bill Wilson, where he kind of concedes, okay, yeah, I agree. You're messing this stuff up here, but you're doing a good job with it, and I can live with it. Just for instance, the very first June 38 edition copy of There Is a Solution was originally 5,810 words. But by the time it gets printed in the multilith copy in February 1939, it's 3,616 words. 2,200 words whacked out of that chapter, people. Again, the original typing of that thing is in one of the appendices in the back of my hardback book. And I think it makes for fascinating reading to see the things that got dropped out. Nothing really important, but, it was overwritten. So they tightened it up, shall we say. February 20th, 1939, just 7 weeks before the big book is published, the pre-publication multilith copy is printed and distributed. It goes to alcoholics, doctors, psychiatrists, ministers, and priests for review, comments, and corrections. Hank Parkhurst is the guy who collects all of those comments, corrections, reviews, suggestions. And he writes them all down in this one multilith copy held in the Newark, New Jersey office. And this is what, on the left-hand side, the first page of There Is a Solution looks like, and on the right-hand side, what the first page of How It Works looks like. Look at that, people. Talk about editing and craziness going on here, I mean, some of this stuff was really, really important. Everybody said, oh, it's a we program. Well, where do we get that? Well, we of Alcoholics Anonymous, we admitted we are powerless over. The word we wasn't in the multilith. That was one of those things somebody said, you should put the word we in there. Really? Now, if you haven't seen this, there's a facsimile of this entire document in a book published by Hazelton called The Book That Started It All. The original working manuscript of Alcoholics Anonymous came out in 2010. It's just, if you're somebody who's serious about early A history, you got to own this book and study it, because there's just great stuff in here. Not only the stuff that got added, like the we, but also stuff that they suggested to add that they didn't take. Really, you didn't take that suggestion. March 1st, 1939, Bill Wilson finally goes back to Akron. Now, he hasn't been there since April of 1930, 11 months earlier. Finally goes back to Akron, and the feedback on the multilith of the big book, well, we don't have anything from Bill completely on this, but on March 9th, a week later, Dr. Bob writes to Frank Amos, one of the Rockefeller guys, and he says, everybody seems to like the book very much. Again, warmest support. March 1939, one editing fact is known for certain. Hank Parkhurst aggressively edited the stories that came out after mid-February. There are 6 handwritten manuscripts in the Stepping Stone archive showing his edits. And man, I'm telling you, this guy was really doing. The Myron Williams story, Hindsight, Hank X'd out the first 7 pages of Myron's 15-page submission. This wasn't light editing. This wasn't wordsmithing here. He was really, really doing a job on these things. Fascinating to see that. But Hank also made one truly important edit to the multilith copy before it was printed in the big book. He added 4 paragraphs to Bill's story. In my opinion, 4 incredibly important paragraphs, certainly important paragraphs to me. Bill's in the hospital. Despite the living example of my friend, that would be Ebby Thatcher, there remained in me the vestiges of my old prejudice. The word God still aroused a certain antipathy. When the thought was expressed that there might be a God personal to me, this feeling was intensified. I didn't like the idea. I could go for such conceptions as creative intelligence, universal mind, or spirit of nature, but I resisted the thought of a czar of the universe, however loving his sway might be. I have since talked with scores of men who felt that way. My friend suggested what then seemed a novel idea. He said, Why don't you choose your own conception of God? That statement hit me hard. It melted the icy intellectual mountain in whose shadow I had lived and shivered many years. I stood in the sunlight at last. It was only a matter of being willing to believe in a power greater than myself. Nothing more was required of me to make my beginning. I saw that growth could start from that point. Upon a foundation of complete willingness, I might build what I saw in my friend. Would I have it? Of course I would. Back to the book that started it all. You can see in the very beginning, Hank Parker's handwriting, these 4 paragraphs that he says need to get inserted in Bill's story. And then when you go to Bill's story, there's a little caret there and it says, this is where the insertion goes right here. We have no idea where the thoughts that appear in those 4 paragraphs actually came from. I mean, was it something Bill dictated to Hank? Was something Hank heard Bill say? I recently got a great suggestion from one of my friends in AA history who said, I think that that's something that Bill Wilson probably said to Hank when Hank was in the hospital bed in Towns Hospital, which is as good an explanation of where this might have come from as any. But anyhow, those 4 paragraphs opening up, why don't you choose your own conception of God really, really, really explicitly, that it's not that explicit anywhere else. Bang, right there. Thank you, thank you, thank you, Hank Parkhurst. But the most important suggestions for the changes to the multilith printing came from a New Jersey psychiatrist named Dr. Howard. He told them that they had to drop all the directive language. You should. It's amazing how directive the multilith printing is. I mean, it's all about you should do this and you must do this and blah, blah. You, really. And he said, look, you gotta put, you can't tell alcoholics anything. You gotta put in some suggestive language. Don't say you should do this. You gotta say, you know what, when we did this, we got this result. This worked for us. You know what really worked for us was when we did this. It has to be suggestive. It can't be directive. You can, kind of a cliche in AA, you can tell alcoholics, but you can't tell them much, and that's what this guy's saying right here. And Bill Wilson was just incensed, and he refused to make those changes. Parkhurst was really big. You got to make the changes. Bill incensed. According to Jimmy Burwell, Bill did go into a tizzy then. He almost blew his top. That was the closest shave we ever had. Here was his baby being torn apart by a screwball psychiatrist. We changed it around in 4 or 5 days. Another one of his talks, he said, this is where the disaster nearly overtook us, for it nearly threw Bill into a terrific mental uproar to have his baby pulled apart by an outside screwball psychiatrist who, in our opinion, knew nothing about alcoholism. March 24th, 1939, 17 days before the book is published, Hank sends Bill Wilson a memo saying that if he won't make those changes, Dr. Howard as suggested, Parker's going to form a committee of 6 or more members, who he tells them who they are, who will take the book away from Bill Wilson and make all those important changes to the text. Big power play by Hank Parkhurst, March 24th, 1939. Bill Wilson caved and made the changes. March 29th, 1939, 5 days later, Hank, Bill, Ruth Hawk drive up to the printer in Cornwall, New York to deliver the manuscript. Dorothy Schneider comes up and joins them a couple of hours later. She's Clarence Schneider of Cleveland, the famous Clarence Schneider of Cleveland. That's Dorothy, his wife. And she joins them. And the printer claims that the print manuscript that Hank has handed to him is illegible. But Hank convinces him to start typesetting by promising that the 4 of them are going to stay there and proofread and correct each page as it comes off. Now, in 1954, in preparation for writing AA Comes of Age, Bill Wilson did a whole bunch of interviews, and boy, they're just wonderful to read the transcripts and listen to them at the GSO archive. But he did this 1954 interview with Dorothy Schneider, and this is after the fact, but this is a woman who was there. She was on the scene when this was going on. She said, I can still see you, Bill. We were reading parts, different phrases to you, and you'd weigh those phrases. Did this really say what you meant? Would it really help somebody? Would it offend this group or that other group? And after one of those discussions, Hank was sort of pounding on you. Now, there's an image for you. Hank was sort of pounding on you that a certain phrase was perhaps too strongly put, probably too religious. I can still hear you say, well, I don't want the thing to be so insipid that they don't get the idea of what they have to do to get sober. That's great. This is my favorite scene out of early A history. I would love to be a fly on the, well, not a fly on the wall, I have to be a fly on the lamppost here. Back in New York City, Dorothy later recalled to Bill in this 1954 interview, she said, she said, do you remember a few days after Cornwall that I was walking down the street with you in New York City, and I can still see you. You must have had a premonition of what this AA was really going to be, because you shuddered all of a sudden and pulled up the collar of your coat and turned to me and you said, good God, Dorothy, suppose this thing really does catch on. And if there are people that really want to stay sober, God, what a great scene that is. We got to make a movie to get that scene in. That's just great. Dorothy said that after this brief moment of uncertainty, they looked at each other and we both laughed. Yeah. Good God, Dorothy, suppose this thing really does catch on. And if there are people that really want to get sober. Shrugged and pulled the collar of his coat up. God, that's just great. April 10th, 1939, the big book is published. The flying blind period is over, and the real life of Alcoholics Anonymous with an explicit 12-step program of recovery begins. Spoiler alert. Having presented an account of the writing of the big book based on primary document research, what follows here is personal opinion. Is AA's birthday really June 10th, 1935? The day Dr. Bob got sober? In my opinion, no, it is not. I believe that the correct date for Alcoholics Anonymous' true birthday is April 10th, 1939, the day the big book was published, and the 12 steps were released to the world for the first time. And I realize that on this issue, I'm just a voice crying in the wilderness, but bear with me while I make an argument for that particular piece of my own opinion. Let's look at a parallel argument from American history. 1765 Parliament passes the Stamp Act. That same year, complaints of no taxation without representation. 5 years later, we got protests resulting in the Boston Massacre. 3 years later, the Boston Tea Party is held. The year after that, the First Continental Congress is held, resulting in a boycott of British goods. And the next year, Patrick Henry screaming in the Virginia legislature, give me liberty or give me death. The same year, Lexington and Concord. The shots heard round the world. They kill a couple of British soldiers, you know. Same year, the Battle of Bunker Hill, and the Second Continental Congress is held. And then in early March of 1776, Washington's army recaptures Boston. All this revolutionary stuff's going on. But on July 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence is signed. Now, this is the day we call the founding of the United States of America, July 4th, not those other dates. In AA history, we have a variety of similar foundational dates. We got Roland talking to Dr. Young. We got Ebby getting sober. We got Ebby talks to Bill. We got Bill getting sober. We got Dr. Bob getting sober. We got the Alcoholic Foundation is formed. We got the steps being written, and the big book is published. It seems to me that given those choices, the day Dr. Bob got sober is at best a long shot third place, with Bill Wilson's sobriety date coming in a close second place after Dr. Bob, and the publication of the big book standing out as the uncontested first place winner. The central importance of that date rests squarely on the fact that that was the day that the 12 steps made their first public appearance ever. How could there really be an Alcoholics Anonymous without the 12 steps? I believe the first publication of the 12 steps is the perfect parallel to the choice of the Declaration of Independence as our founding date for the United States of America, because despite all those other important events, after July 4th, this is why we picked this date, people, after July 4th, everything was different, and most especially, that day forward, there was no going back. No going back. If we hadn't won the revolution, all those guys at the Continental Convention on July 4th, they would have been hung as traitors. There was no going back from that day forward. The first publication of the 12 steps is, in my mind, of equal importance because after April 10th, 1939, everything was different. And from that day forward, there was no going back. There was, in fact, no AA until the day the 12 steps were published for the first time. The steps, which are suggested, a very specific program of recovery. And that's the end of my personal screed.